Before tomorrow morning arrives, before the world wakes up, before people begin moving in noise and distraction, God wants you to hear this. Not later, not next week, not after another sign, but now. If you are listening to this, it is because something has already been sealed in your spirit, and this message would not be reaching you unless timing itself had aligned with precision. Chosen one, what feels like loneliness right now is not rejection. It is divine protection. Before we go any further, do something simple but powerful. Type, "I am chosen," in the comments. Not for me, but for alignment, for confirmation, for spiritual acknowledgement. And if this message resonates, like this video and subscribe, because these words are not random. They are directed. Now listen carefully. There is a very specific kind of quiet that descends on a person just before God moves them forward. It does not feel peaceful at first. It feels empty, detached, almost uncomfortable, like the world suddenly stepped back and left you alone with your thoughts. You may have noticed fewer messages, fewer calls, less interest in socializing, and a growing distance between you and people who once felt close, and part of you may have wondered, did I do something wrong? Why do I feel unseen? Why am I alone when others seem surrounded? Chosen one, hear this clearly. God isolates before He elevates. Loneliness is not always absence. Sometimes it is removal. Sometimes it is shielding. Right now you are in a phase where God is protecting you from interference, protecting your mind from confusion, your heart from manipulation, and your spirit from distractions that would delay what is coming. Not everyone who had access to you was meant to walk with you into the next season, and if they stayed, they would have slowed you down, drained you, or distorted your clarity. This separation is not punishment. It is preparation. God is recalibrating you in silence, teaching you to hear Him without background noise, to trust Him without external validation, and to stand firm without constant reassurance from people. When the crowd disappears, it reveals who you are without applause, and that is where true strength is formed. You are being refined in private so you can walk in authority in public. What feels like being overlooked is actually God removing eyes that were never meant to witness your elevation. The quiet you are in is holy ground, and the stillness you feel is not stagnation. It is alignment. Soon, very soon, you will look back and realize that this season of isolation saved you from paths you were never meant to take, and people who were never meant to follow you forward. Remain steady, remain faithful, and remain obedient, because when God brings you out of this protected silence, you will move with clarity, confidence, and undeniable purpose. Now, let's dive deeper. Point 1. Why God allows loneliness before spiritual expansion. Loneliness is often misinterpreted because the human mind associates constant presence with safety, approval, and survival. Yet on a spiritual level, excessive presence creates vulnerability rather than strength, because too many voices dilute discernment, and too many expectations fracture identity. God removes people not to punish you, but to stabilize you, to quiet the emotional noise that once governed your decisions, and to protect what is being refined within you. At this stage in your life, your nervous system is recalibrating after years of overstimulation, disappointment, and subtle betrayal. And that recalibration makes you intolerant to emotional chaos, shallow conversations, performative relationships, and connections that require you to dim your depth in order to be accepted. This is why loneliness feels sharper now than it did before, not because you are weaker, but because you are more conscious of what drains you and what distorts your inner alignment. Awareness amplifies sensation, and as your perception grows clearer, anything misaligned feels heavier, louder, and more intrusive than it once did. God isolates chosen ones when their inner voice is becoming strong enough to be trusted, because discernment cannot mature in constant distraction. Noise interferes with intuition, familiarity blunts perception, and habitual access to others creates dependency on external validation rather than internal truth. Isolation sharpens perception by removing interference, allowing you to hear yourself think without negotiating your reality through the expectations of others. This phase exists so your decisions stop being influenced by fear of abandonment and start being guided by truth, clarity, and inner authority. You are learning how to stand without leaning, how to choose without needing consensus, and how to trust insight over impulse. Loneliness is not absence, it is containment. It is a spiritual boundary placed around you so nothing corrupts what is forming. You are being held in stillness because stillness is where identity solidifies and purpose becomes unmistakable. What feels like emptiness is actually precision, a narrowing of influence so your life stops scattering energy and starts moving with direction. This solitude is not permanent, but it is necessary, because the next connections you attract must meet you where you are becoming, not where you used to survive. Point 2. The psychological shift that happens during divine isolation. When external validation disappears, the mind initially panics because it has been trained to measure safety, worth, and direction through response. It searches for reassurance in familiar places, replaying old conversations, old roles, and old versions of itself that once produced approval. This is not weakness, it is conditioning surfacing. The nervous system has not yet learned that silence is not rejection. But as time stretches and resistance slowly fades, something subtle begins to occur. The noise loses momentum, the compulsive checking quiets. You start hearing yourself again, not the voice shaped by expectation, but the original internal signal that was buried beneath performance. Thoughts slow down because they are no longer competing for validation. Emotional reactions shorten because they are no longer trying to be understood by an audience. You become less reactive, less defensive, and less urgent in explaining yourself, because there is no longer a need to prove reality to anyone outside you. This is psychological maturity forming in real time. Most people never reach this stage because they fill silence immediately, numbing it with distraction, relationships, arguments, or constant output. Chosen ones, however, are allowed to sit in the quiet long enough for identity to detach from approval. In this phase, loneliness is not punishment, it is exposure. It reveals unconscious attachments you could not see while surrounded by feedback. It shows where you were over-giving to earn connection, over-explaining to avoid misunderstanding, and over-compromising to remain accepted. Without external mirrors, these patterns surface clearly, not as shame, but as information. God does not rush this process because self-awareness cannot be forced or taught intellectually. It must emerge organically, through lived stillness. If the process were shortened, the old dependencies would simply reattach in a new form. That is why it feels slow. That is why it feels empty before it feels clear. You are not being ignored during this season. You are being recalibrated. Neural pathways are loosening. Emotional reflexes are being retrained. Your sense of self is being rebuilt without an audience. This is where discernment sharpens, boundaries solidify, and peace becomes less reactive and more structural. When validation eventually returns, it will no longer control you. When connection resumes, it will no longer define you. You're not losing anything in this phase. You're shedding what could not follow you forward. Point 3. Why God removes familiar faces, not strangers. Notice this carefully and let it settle deeply within you. God rarely removes strangers first. He removes the familiar, the voices you recognized, the presence you leaned on, the people you assumed would always be within reach. This is not abandonment, and it is not punishment. It is precision. Familiar people carry emotional weight, and emotional weight can quietly shape identity. Their approval can steady you, but their doubt can destabilize you even faster. Even when their intentions are pure, their proximity can subtly interfere with the work God is doing inside you. This is why the separation feels confusing and personal. God is not attacking the relationship, He is protecting the assignment. For chosen ones, this stage is essential because your calling demands an identity that does not collapse when support disappears. You are being taught to stand without emotional scaffolding, to remain rooted when affirmation is absent, and to hear divine direction without the static of external influence. Leadership, true leadership, cannot be built on constant reassurance. Guidance cannot flow clearly through someone who needs to be understood before they can obey. In this phase, you learn how to remain centered when you are misunderstood, unseen, or unsupported. You learn how to regulate your spirit instead of reacting from wounded attachment. You learn discernment instead of dependency. This is not a season of isolation for isolation's sake. It is a season of calibration. God is stabilizing your inner world so external changes no longer dictate your peace. Silence becomes your classroom. Stillness becomes your training ground. In the absence of familiar voices, you begin to recognize the sound of your own convictions, and beneath that, the quiet certainty of God's guidance. Crowds cannot teach this. Constant connection cannot produce this. Only separation can. When the familiar is removed, what remains is truth. What remains is faith that no longer borrows strength from proximity. What remains is an identity that can stand alone without becoming lonely, be strong without becoming hardened, and be focused without becoming bitter. This is where emotional maturity is forged. This is where you stop seeking permission to become who you are already called to be. And when this phase completes its work, the familiar may return in a new form, or it may not. Either way, you will no longer need it to stand. You will move forward, grounded, steady, and internally anchored, capable of carrying responsibility without losing yourself, capable of loving without attachment, and capable of walking confidently even when the path is quiet. Point 4. Loneliness as spiritual protection, not delay. Many assume isolation means something has gone wrong, that distance is evidence of failure, rejection, or loss, but in truth, isolation often means something has gone right at a level most people never reach. You are being protected from premature exposure to environments, relationships, and narratives that would have demanded access to a version of you that was not yet fortified. Some callings collapse if revealed too early, not because they are weak, but because they are powerful before they are stable. Some blessings are fragile before maturity, like seeds that must remain underground long enough to develop roots strong enough to survive the surface. God hides chosen ones, not to withhold abundance, but to preserve it, to shield what carries long-term impact from short-term interference. During this phase, your growth is internal, quiet, and largely invisible to the outside world, but it is irreversible once completed. You are learning how to self-regulate your emotions without external reassurance, how to self-validate without applause, and how to self-govern without supervision. These are not survival skills, they are leadership traits. This season strips away dependency so authority can be installed. Protection often looks like exclusion until you understand what you were being saved from. You were spared the emotional debt that comes from overgiving to people who could not reciprocate your depth. You were spared spiritual leakage that occurs when your energy is constantly explained, negotiated, or diluted to be understood. You were spared repeating cycles that would have delayed you years, cycles disguised as familiarity, comfort, or loyalty. Isolation recalibrates your nervous system, teaching you peace without chaos, clarity without noise, and direction without consensus. It trains you to hear instruction without confusion, and to move without needing permission. What feels like loneliness is actually refinement, the removal of distractions so discernment can sharpen. This is where your standards rise quietly, where your boundaries solidify without announcement, and where your identity becomes anchored rather than reactive. When you emerge, you will notice that what once tempted you no longer reaches you, and what once intimidated you no longer impresses you. The silence was not abandonment, it was preparation. The distance was not punishment, it was alignment. You were not forgotten, you were being positioned. And when the timing is right, what was hidden will be revealed with stability, authority, and peace that cannot be shaken. Point 5. The test of stillness and self-trust. This phase tests one thing above all else. Can you trust yourself without external confirmation? And that question is not asked loudly or dramatically. It is whispered into the quiet corners of your life where no one is watching, no one is applauding, and no one is offering reassurance. It is in those moments that your true alignment is revealed. Can you still move with integrity when your choices bring no immediate reward? Can you still choose patience when forcing an outcome would feel easier? Can you sit with your own thoughts without numbing them through distraction, noise, or validation from others? This is where many people fail, not because they are weak, but because they have never learned how to be alone with their own spirit. Chosen ones are tested in stillness because stillness strips away performance. It removes the audience. It exposes motive. When there is no one to impress, no one to prove wrong, and no one to lean on, what remains is the truth of who you are becoming. If your obedience depended on praise, it will fade here. If your faith depended on visible results, it will waver here. But if your alignment is real, it will deepen quietly, almost invisibly, like roots growing underground long before anything breaks the surface. God observes how you treat yourself in silence, not how you present yourself in public. He watches whether you speak to yourself with patience or cruelty, whether you rush to fill emptiness with noise, or allow that emptiness to teach you what still needs healing. This phase is not punishment. It is refinement. It teaches you how to wait without resentment, how to move without rushing, and how to trust without needing proof. The loneliness you feel is not abandonment. It is space being cleared. Space for discernment, space for maturity, space for strength that does not depend on circumstances. When you learn to remain steady here, you stop chasing signs because you become one. This test is quiet, but its results are permanent. Once you pass it, you no longer collapse under silence. You no longer panic when nothing is happening. You understand that stillness is not stagnation, it is preparation. And from that place, when movement finally comes, it comes with precision, authority, and peace that cannot be shaken. Point 6. What changes after the isolation ends? When this phase lifts, you will notice something immediately, and it will not be loud or dramatic, but precise and undeniable. You will no longer crave proximity the way you once did, because the hunger you felt before was never for people. It was for alignment. You will no longer tolerate confusion, mixed signals, or emotional static, because your nervous system has recalibrated itself to truth. Your standards will rise naturally, without effort or force, the same way your body rejects spoiled food without needing a lecture. People will feel different to you now. Some will feel lighter, others heavier, and you will sense this instantly, without overthinking or justification. Conversations will reveal themselves within minutes. You will know who is present and who is performing. This is discernment. You did not become cold, distant, or detached. You became clear. Clarity can feel like coldness to those who benefited from your former confusion. When connections return, and they will, you will not chase them, manage them, or contort yourself to keep them alive. You will observe them. You will allow people to reveal who they are through consistency, not promises. Isolation taught you something priceless. Your peace is not negotiable, not tradable, not something you sacrifice for familiarity or comfort. You learned how much energy it costs to abandon yourself, and you will never willingly pay that price again. Relationships will now be chosen deliberately, not accepted by default, and not inherited through habit, guilt, or loneliness. You will no longer ask to be understood by those unwilling to listen. You will no longer over-explain your boundaries. You will simply move accordingly. This is the quiet confidence of someone who has survived their own inner wilderness and returned with wisdom. This is not superiority. This is self-respect stabilized. This is the mark of spiritual authority, where your presence is calm, your decisions are clean, and your life is no longer shaped by fear, but by alignment. Point 7. Final integration and assurance. If you feel alone but not lost, this message is confirmation, because there is a difference between isolation and abandonment, and your spirit recognizes that difference even if your mind still wrestles with it. If you feel quiet but stable, this message is alignment, because true alignment does not announce itself with noise, urgency, or emotional highs. It settles you, steadies you, and removes the need to explain yourself to the world. Before tomorrow morning, God wanted you grounded, not questioning, rooted rather than reaching, and centered rather than searching for signs outside of yourself. The loneliness you feel is not a void, it is a womb, a sacred interior space where distraction is removed so formation can begin. Nothing that is meant to last is built in a crowded room, and nothing that carries weight is shaped in haste. Something is forming within you that requires stillness, patience, and privacy. Something that cannot be rushed, forced, or prematurely revealed. You are not being left behind while others move ahead. You are being prepared ahead of time, positioned before the moment arrives, so you will not have to scramble when it does. What feels like delay is actually reinforcement. What feels like separation is actually protection. And what feels like silence is instruction without words. You are learning to stand without leaning, to listen without panic, and to trust without constant reassurance. This phase is teaching your nervous system calm, your spirit resilience, and your heart discernment. Stay anchored, not emotionally reactive. Stay observant, not suspicious or fearful. Stay faithful, not because everything is clear, but because peace has replaced confusion. This phase will end, because all seasons do, but the strength it builds will remain. And when the doors open, you will enter without needing permission, approval, or explanation. If this resonates deeply, comment, "I am chosen," not as a declaration to others, but as a reminder to yourself of who you already are.